A bride is tramping down a meadow. There is no soul on the way to a stone-built house, and her anxious pacing is the only movement noticeable in the area. With watery eyes, she enters the building, and as she gazes at a man standing fearfully in front of her, we see a pistol in her hand. Chaos ensues. The man tries to neutralize her, and the shot is fired. Years pass. An old and wrinkly grandma is looking at the photos of her youth. The flow of her memories is interrupted by the voices coming from outside her room. There are loud preparations going on, since the big family gathering is about to happen. Coming out, the grandma sees her daughters and hears voices coming from the entrance. This is when she understands that her grandson, Tomaso, has arrived. The young and energetic man jumps into the scene and embraces everybody. His brother, the more serious-looking Antonio, comes after him as well. Once they are all around the table, we learn how much they like to speak. From the never-ending flow of conversations, we learn that they run a pasta-making company. Colorful personalities and mini conflicts come to the surface, and toast after toast is raised. Afterwards, Tomaso strolls the streets and talks to his love on the phone when something unexpected happens. From a car that almost runs over him comes an attractive woman. Slowly and elegantly, she walks over to a fancy car, sharpens her key, and scratches the entire circumference of someone else's vehicle without flinching. Pleased with herself, she watches her piece of art and decides that something is missing. Walking back to its front door, she gets her heels and cracks the side view mirror. After being almost run over, Tomaso is eager to confront her. But watching her behavior, he has clearly reconsidered being hostile. Following him throughout the rest of his day, we see him speaking with his brother, Antonio. As it turns out, he has 3 important news items to share during the upcoming dinner. First of all, he has never studied economics, as their parents always wanted. Secondly, he endeavors to become a writer. And thirdly, and most importantly, he is gay. Antonio doesn't seem very pleased by those news stories. Not because he doesn't like it, but because he knows that breaking those news stories over the dinner table will cause an enormous commotion. He urges his younger brother to leave that information to himself and continue living peacefully. But creating commotion is exactly what Tomaso wants. His father has been trying to drag Tomaso into the pasta business, and if he finds out that he's gay, he will kick him out of it forever. Tomaso will be free. That night, a thief comes to their house, but the members of the family have no great reaction to it. As it seems, the thief is a regular visitor. The next morning, Tomaso is speaking with his boyfriend Marco on the phone when he notices the same young woman coming out of her car nearby. This girl is clearly attracting his attention, to the point where he has to hang up on Marco. Returning to his wealthy family, he sees Antonio standing next to that exact girl. During the introduction, Tomaso learns that her name is Alba Brunetti, and that she's the daughter of the commander, their new business partner. As Antonio emphasizes, they all used to play together when they were little, but neither Tomaso nor Brunetti remember each other. Tension is created between the two. This tension, however, is nothing compared to the tension that breaks out over the dinner table that evening. As cheerful stories are told, Tomaso is completely drawn by his anxiety. Going over sentences inside his mind, he prepares himself for the big coming out and seeks a perfect opportunity to fulfill his plan. Finally, he realizes that there will be no perfect opportunities today. Silence will never fall, so he will have to make one for himself. Clinking his glass, he asks for attention half-heartedly and begins his speech. This is the moment when something extremely unexpected happens. Antonio interrupts him rigorously, and as all eyes direct towards him, he starts telling the story of a boy who used to work in a factory and hide his true identity from his family. This boy liked another boy, and as seconds go by, it becomes more and more obvious that he is speaking about himself. His father, Vincenzo, and his mother, Stefania, listen fearfully until he finally comes out. Clearly and decisively, he tells everyone around the table that he is gay. Terrible chaos is expected, but instead, Stefania and Vincenzo start laughing anxiously. They do everything to deny this news and change the subject, but Antonio doesn't let them do that. In the end, with an unstoppable and uncontrollable rage, Vincenzo's face becomes bright red, and he sends his son to his room, demanding that he leave the city tomorrow. Naturally, he is fired from his job as well. Tomaso is silently sitting in his seat. His opportunity is stolen. Everything he wanted is now in Antonio's hands. Stefania follows her son upstairs. Quietly, she watches the young man as he packs his bags grievingly and leaves the house. Coming back to the dinner table, the mother encounters an increasingly rising tension. The people gathered try to calm Vincenzo as the man becomes more and more frustrated. Soon, he loses control over his behavior completely, and feels an irresistible pain in the chest area. It is clear that he is suffering a heart attack. Thankfully, the father of the family endures the heart attack. The first thing he does after coming back to his senses is call Tomaso into the room. Now this young man is his only hope. Speaking emotionally, he begs his younger son to stay in the city and take his brother's place. He has no one left but himself. He speaks with such expressions that Tomaso finds himself at a stopping point. He has no other choice but to say yes. The next morning, he is speaking with Marco about this issue, hearing about possible solutions that seem impossible to him. Suddenly, he sees Alba's car, and as always, his attention goes away. Looking around, he finds her sitting on a stone chair behind him, smoking a cigarette elegantly. Once he hangs up on Marco, he learns about the reason for her visit. She is here to take him to the factory. All the responsibilities that Antonio used to handle are now in Tomaso's hands, and Brunetti is the only person to help him out. Luciana, Stefania's sister, waits around for a thief that night. Clearly, she is dressed up for this kind of occasion. The next morning, Tomaso finds Stefania going over Antonio's things. Anxiously, she is thinking to herself that Antonio must have lied. She is his mother, and if he were really gay, she would have surely noticed. The young man must have wanted to switch cities or free himself from responsibilities. There is no other option she can think of that makes sense. Suddenly, she finds pictures of him standing next to a factory worker, and it all becomes clear to her. Only now does she begin to see her memories in a different light and find that Antonio has always shown girly tendencies. She remembers a moment when he brought a basket full of leaves to her, and to her terror, she learns that it was Tomaso that did it, not Antonio. Now she begins to think that Tomaso is gay as well. Even though her youngest son doesn't express it explicitly, Stefania begins to doubt that she has overlooked far too much in her life. In the next scene, she and her husband discuss this matter. If anyone finds out about Antonio, the news will spread with the speed of light. The grandma is the most dangerous in this regard. She's the only one whose discretion they do not trust. In other words, she is a loose cannon. Stefania tells Vincenzo everything, other than the part in which Tomaso is a potential family shamer as well. Hilariously enough, we learn soon that Vincenzo's paramedic is gay as well. The man's sorrows are soothed by a woman, far too intimately, when Stefania enters the room. She sees the two, drawn by the romance of the moment, and interrupts them harshly. Vincenzo's expressions change immediately, but nothing serious happens. As it turns out, Stefania knows about her husband's cheating, and chooses to only scold him harshly for his behavior. That evening, after work, Tomaso and Alba eat sandwiches together at her place. They don't speak much, but Alba watches all his movements carefully and attentively throughout the whole process. Perhaps her intuition is telling her something that needs a good check. Later that night, when Tomaso comes back home, he is met with his grandmother. As it turns out, the grandma is a person who's been a go-to person for both brothers when they were in need of a good listener and a good conversation. Now too, Tomaso initiates a dialogue and learns that she's been the only person with whom Antonio spoke about his orientation before he officially came out in front of everybody. It wasn't necessary, though. Thanks to her strong intuition, she has always known, sitting in front of her grandchild. She remembers how she met with Nicola, the love of her life, and staring into Tomaso's eyes, emphasizing that one must not live according to the will of others. Perhaps she knows about Tomaso as well. Gazing at him, the memories of her youth start coming to her. In the recollection that arises in her conscious mind, she is coming out of the house grievingly, holding the hand of her love. Her entire organism tells her to stay, but she follows Nicola towards a future that doesn't feel right. When Vincenzo finally comes out of the hospital, he directs all his forces towards Tomaso. Wanting to appear as if he has no worries in the world, he laughs in the streets for no particular reason, and speaks about Alba far too often. Soon, he notices people laughing around him as well, and feels as if they are laughing at him. Paranoid, he becomes anxious, and as he does his best to laugh along, his eyes fill up with tears. When Tomaso takes him home, the grandma expresses how ashamed she is of her son. She doesn't want to keep looking at Vincenzo, whose homophobia is far too great. To be honest, nobody really wants to look at him, so everybody tells him to take a rest, and one by one they leave his room. Tomaso tries to do the same, but he's the main focus of Vincenzo's attention now, as if his own desperation were not enough. All the desperation of his father is also flowing over him. Life goes on then, and Tomaso becomes a good friend with Alba. And as Vincenzo keeps crying over his morally astray son, the distance between his other son and Brunetti shrinks in size. It all gets to a point where Tomaso tells her about his boyfriend, Marco. As rain pelts down on the streets outside, he talks about what he loves about him. His back is turned to Alba, so he fails to notice tears building up in her eyes. She seems disappointed to have found out. The next day, Tomaso finally begins making his own decisions at work. For the first time, a woman from their family starts working in the factory. It is Tomaso's sister, Elena. As time goes on, Alba opens up to Tomaso as well. She tells him how her mother got sick and how she had to take over the house when she was only 14. The things she went through in those times are heartbreaking, and they move Tomaso deeply. He finds himself getting drawn by this woman. He wants to soothe her sorrows, to show warmth and care, but seeing her gaze, he backs away. Alba is trying to find a glimpse of love in Tomaso's eyes, but she finds nothing but haste. When Tomaso leaves her apartment that night, he suddenly hears the voice of his brother calling him from behind. The reunion is quiet, but accepting at first. In this intimate, brotherly moment, Antonio shares why he did it. As it turns out, he used to sabotage his relationship with his boyfriend for a very long time. Trying his best to hide his secret life, he created a distance that destroyed his relationship. He came out in front of their family that day to show his boyfriend that he still cared. But as he now says, it wasn't enough. Suddenly Antonio turns hostile, saying that it is all Tomaso's fault. After he left for Rome to live freely, he became responsible for staying here and working for their father. Conflict breaks out. The brothers soon start fighting in the street, and there is no sign of resolution. A belief filled with bitterness comes to the surface. To earn their freedom, the brothers must fight with each other. The next morning, Tomaso mentions Antonio's name during breakfast. Naturally, Vincenzo immediately becomes frustrated. But that doesn't stop Tomaso or his grandmother from keeping speaking about him. The grandma acts especially provocatively. She has the most influence over Vincenzo, and her remarks hurt him the most. Tomaso tells him to let Antonio come back, but the man maintains his firm homophobic stance, despite everything. Once Tomaso enters the factory and gets prepared for work, he goes over to Aline, and unexpectedly, he tells her that he is gay. The sisters' expressions don't really change. Surprisingly, for Tomaso, Elena has known it for a long time. As she says, she knew about Antonio as well. It is not a big deal to her. The most important thing is whether her brother is happy or not. Her position brings a smile to Tomaso's face. He is happy that his sister is so supportive. In the next scene, the grandmother has a conversation with Alba. It seems that the two are much like one another. Here, Alba is told about Nicola, the love of Nana's life. As it turns out, the man was her brother-in-law. Even though she wasn't married to him, her love never faded away. It was an impossible love, and as sad as it might sound, those are the kinds of love that last forever. In contrast to this meaningful episode, we see Luciana and Stefania strolling the city anxiously in the next scene. They can't help but notice that everybody's watching them. Still, for a while, it is thought that they are only paranoid. But soon, we find out that the gossip about Antonio has already made a few laps around the city. Everybody knows it. One individual even tried to embarrass Stefania, but Stefania didn't let her have her victory. Later that night, Vincenzo is trying to soothe his fears and frustrations with his lover, while Tomaso has some fun at a party. Alba is there too, and she sees the young man as he makes conversations with other guys. At first glance, nothing special is happening, but Brunetti's sharp eye manages to notice that something is going on. When the two return home together, she addresses that issue. She knows what those guys told Tomaso. They were speaking about her, and surely they must have told him that she's sick, rich, and spoiled. And it doesn't matter that Tomaso is trying to deny it. Alba knows that it is true. She can never get close to anyone, and thanks to her obsessions, intimacy is almost an unattainable goal. Suddenly, listening to her speak this desperately, something changes in Tomaso. Quickly and unexpectedly, he kisses Alba. It is a short and timid kiss, but it puts a smile on both faces. They say goodbye then, and go on their separate ways. The next morning, an unusual commotion forced Tomaso to go down. What he sees down there freezes him in one place. His friends from Rome have arrived. Marco, Tomaso's boyfriend, is here too. The moment is extremely comical. Two groups are facing each other like a couple from completely different worlds, but Tomaso's family doesn't act as if they understand anything. The men from Rome are clearly feminine, but Vincenzo grins as if his son is getting married. As Marco and others say, they are just swinging by. They were going on a beach and were nearby. Vincenzo and others have no intention to let them go. They make them stay over dinner and promise that they will go to the beach together. In the next scene, we see conflict breaking out between Marco and Tomaso for the first time. Marco misses him and fails to understand why his boyfriend is so distant all of a sudden. His new life and new responsibilities have created a gap between them, and it makes him bitter. Tomaso, on the other hand, wants Marco to understand that he has no choice. He is here because his life demands that he do so. He cannot simply get up and leave, because in a way, he accepts and loves his family as it is. Everyone shows special care in the preparation process for the dinner then. Vincenzo buys some products and boasts about Tomaso's handsome friends, while the four gay men try to come up with ways in which they will best hide their sexual orientation. The single Luciana dresses up as well, but to her misfortune, she loses her contact lenses. She will have to wear glasses this evening. To see all those motives intertwine with each other is a hilarious thing. Tomaso's friends struggle a lot, but the family is eager to see heterosexual men in them, and so most of them fail to notice anything. When the dinner starts, a number of underlying events start taking place. Elena's husband deserves one of Tomaso's friends' sharp focus, while Alba realizes that Marco is the man Tomaso spoke to her about. All of the friends are invited to stay in the city for a couple of days. Once all is prepared for bed, David, one of the friends, decides to go downstairs and have a glass of water, when he suddenly encounters Luciana sitting in the living room, drinking some alcohol. She seems to be into David a little too much, so she invites him to have a seat with her. Luciana is already drunk, so this is going to be David's biggest exam today. Meanwhile, Marco goes over to Tomaso's room and knocks. He wants to spend the night with him. For a while, he thinks that the door won't open, but once he turns around and takes a couple of steps, Tomaso runs from his room and embraces him from behind. In this moment, the passion between them is rekindled. As Alba's wide, open eyes stare at the moon later that night, Tomaso gazes in the same direction, while Marco's head rests on his shoulder. The next morning, Stefania goes up to Marco. She knows that he is a doctor, and she also knows that Tomaso and him are very close friends, so she asks him a very personal question about her son. She is interested in knowing if, from a medical perspective, he can be treated. She wants to know if a gay man can become normal again. Marco tries to explain to her that it is not a disease. It's more like a feature, and no medicine can change it. Speaking of homosexuality, 3 of Tomaso's friends exit the house and interrupt their conversation. They are going to the beach. Seeing Marco in the water, the love he has for him started to come back to Tomaso in full force. And seeing this affection, Alba's eyes speak both sorrow and awe. Before one group splits into 2, and the friends drive away, Marco tells Tomaso that another publisher turned down his novel. Seeing his love drive away, coupled with this bad news, puts a sorrowful look on his face. Alba understands what's going on in his mind, so she decides to ask him about it. As Tomaso says, his book is about a couple that is no longer together. One feels pain and an incredible sense of loss, but the other one doesn't. In the end, the book tries to show that one should not be afraid of loss, because what's truly important never leaves us. Alba understands what he means. She understands the implications of it as well. If Tomaso's words are true, when you walk away from somebody, you leave nothing behind. Having recalled what writing means to him, Tomaso decides to do something unexpected. In the next scene, at the breakfast table, he stops Vincenzo from going away. He wants to speak to him about something, but the man is late for work, so he doesn't listen at first. To force him to turn around, Tomaso clinks his glass, and this reminds his father of the moment Antonio came out in front of the entire family. This is a noise that foretells something very important coming. For a moment, we think that Tomaso is about to declare that he's gay, but instead, he says that he doesn't want to work in the factory anymore. His real passion is writing, and he prefers to live out his days doing what he loves. To put down words on paper is what allows him to express himself, and there is no other feeling like it. Vincenzo doesn't flip out. He listens to his son, converging and red-faced, but says nothing in return. Once Tomaso is done sharing, he realizes that his father will try to make him reconsider. This is why he decides not to engage in a conversation. He stands up, and even though his parents ask him to stay, he steps away from the house. Once he is gone, the grandmother's expressions begin to change. It seems as if she was inspired by Tomaso's courage. She asks their maid to prepare a car for her, and enters the house to get ready to go out. That afternoon is a time of reflection for all. Once Nana dresses up and prepares fully for the evening, she starts eating all the food that is medically restricted to her. It seems as if she is getting ready for her last stroll around the city. We pick up the story the next morning, when she wakes up Tomaso and praises his boldness. It's good that he's eager to be free and make mistakes on his own. because that's the only precondition for happiness. After hearing this, Tomaso's expressions change abruptly. Suddenly, he realizes that this is only a dream, a phantom. His grandma isn't really standing in front of him. Drawn by some dark premonition, Tomaso hears grieving noises coming from outside and, going over to check what's happening, finds out that Nana is no longer alive. Nana's passing will bring the entire family together. In this moment of grief, they realize what's truly important, and the problems are resolved almost effortlessly. The grandmother was called a loose cannon her whole life, and in this moment, she fulfilled the meaning of her name. After the loose cannon is shot, everything is dismantled. The vicious tie of petty issues is destroyed, and it allows better, healthier resolutions to bloom.